this whole idea or theory come from? During the 1980s, there was Professor Barker, David Barker. He was in the UK, and all of a sudden he was from Hertfordshire, and all of a sudden he started seeing that there were a lot of people who passed away from coronary heart disease. So it was like a phenomenon that suddenly developed, and he wasn't sure where that came from. So they had very good birth records over the decades, and he started digging into that and going back to see if he could find anything that could explain this phenomenon. So he had, just in his town where he was from, he had about 16,000 people that he could trace from birth to adult life. And what he found who succumbed to coronary heart, what was the reason? And when he looked at the time of their birth, it was in the 1930s, 1940s, when there were famines in quite a few places. And for various reasons, it might have been drought, and some of that was due to, it was in the war periods where people were restricted to what provisions they got in certain towns and so forth. So this was triggered due to a food shortage, which was experienced in different parts of the world for various periods of times and various reasons. So he found that twice the number of people with a low birth weight of less than 2.5 kgs developed coronary heart disease when compared to those with a normal or higher birth weight. And he then looked into other incidents. So once he proposed his hypothesis, he was actually met with a whole lot of opposition, and people didn't like what he was saying. But in different parts of Europe, people were experiencing a similar situation, similar phenomenon. And they then started looking at his hypothesis to see, was there maybe anything solid in what he is proposing and what he is saying? So what they found was that there was a famine in Holland, and during that time, it was a very short time, very short period of time. The daily intake of pregnant ladies was very low. So it was below 1,000 calories per day. But because that famine was short, the fetuses did not experience malnutrition during infancy. So while they were in the womb, they were starved, but by the time they were born, things had gone back to normal. So the intrauterine environment of these babies, therefore, did not match their extrauterine environment in which food was readily available. And subsequently, they exhibited like a catch-up or compensatory growth during infancy. So what they found was they were born small, and the idea was that they now need catch-up feeding. So they must now be fed to make up the weight that they've lost. And they became obese children. And as they grew into adulthood, they became insulin resistant. They developed hypertension. They developed high cholesterol. And it took a while before the clinicians understood that there was a danger in that catch-up growth. So they didn't understand it at the time. David, can I just ask you something? David?
Yes.
Did you distribute the presentation? Did you share it with the audience? Can you hear me? David? Can you hear me?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Did you share the presentation with the audience?
No.
Not yet.
Not
Okay,
yet.
so sorry, because I put a few extra slides in, which I'll share with you, just to give them a little bit of the background. All right, let's carry on. Now, on the other hand, there was in Russia, there was also a famine. And that famine lasted a long time. So it lasted more than 800 days. That was a couple of years. So what happened there was the babies who were subjected to restricted calorie intake in the uterus, once they were born, there was still famine. So they still had little to eat. So they developed what is now called a thrifty phenotype, where they had to make do with what they had, and their bodies adapted to that. So malnutrition in their intrauterine environment was well matched to the malnutrition they experienced outside the womb. And that offered them a form of protection against future adult diseases. Now, unfortunately, this mismatch and its consequences still applies today. Even though we may not experience famines, and in Africa there are places like in Yemen, and there are countries who do experience famine, but in different ways, this mismatch and its consequences applies today. So according to the WHO, more than 30 million infants are born with a low birth weight. fast food.
Sorry, Barbara, I just had to start recording again, okay?
Okay, it's all right. So people resort to fast foods instead of a healthy diet. They just grab these fatty foods. The other problem is that in well-resourced countries, we tend to eat high-calorie, high-fat diets. There's limited action. Our children sit and they play with their cell phones or play computer games, and they don't do any activity. And so today we are really plagued by obesity amongst young children and adolescents who develop insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, hypertension. So the epidemic of our time is type 2 diabetes. So we cannot ignore this information because it is an epidemic of our day. So what then is the Barker hypothesis? Professor Barker suggested that the environment in which a fetus develops plays a crucial role in what their health is going to be in adulthood. And this, it seems like when the fetus is starved in utero, it reprograms itself so that it is adapted to its extrauterine environment, in which it believes, or its body or its cells believes that it will still starve once it is born. So the baby is led to think, I'm not getting nutrition in the uterus, I will probably also not get it outside. And therefore, it programs itself in a different way. And in two specific ways. Number one, through reduced body size. So it has got fewer cells and all the organs are smaller, and an altered metabolism in order to preserve the little nutrition that it gets. So that's what it is reprogrammed to survive. So it already can start at the time of conception, where if there's already undernutrition at the time that conception takes place, then the inner cell mass can have fewer cells. So that is already something that can happen very, very, very early in the pregnancy. Now, when that fetus comes out, like in the instance of the Dutch famine, and now there is plenty of food, or the parents or the doctor or whoever thinks that this baby must make up feed, what happens is the organs cannot cope with it. The kidneys are not well enough developed to cope with the extra load. The pancreas doesn't have enough cells, so it cannot make enough insulin. Even the muscles, everything has been taught to conserve energy, to conserve the nutrition that it gets, and it eventually affects the whole body. So the fetus adapts and responds to the malnutrition by trading off the development of less essential organs, for instance, the kidney and the pancreas, in favor of more important organs such as the brain, in a phenomenon which we call brain sparing. So I don't know who of you are familiar with the term brain sparing. We will talk about it a little bit in the second part of this talk. So it thus appears as if the body's memory of starvation is lasting. So once the baby is exposed to undernutrition for whatever reason, or inadequate nutrition for whatever reason, is it because the parents are not eating correctly, because they also grab the fast foods, or whether it is because there's really a lack of nutrients, it translates into pathology in later life. And I have just given you a few of the pathologies and reasons why that pathology then manifests in the adult. So coronary heart disease, there's two big things. There are other things also, but two big things is impaired liver growth leads to unregulated cholesterol production, so that they produce more of the low density lipoproteins and less of the high density lipoproteins. Those children also have got narrower and less elastic arteries, and that predisposes to plaque formation. So all of that gives rise then to coronary heart disease. The reduced number of nephrons and the reduced elasticity of blood vessels lead to hypertension. Reduced number of pancreatic B cells leads to reduced insulin production, and then you go into your diabetes. So you see that the question that I posed at the beginning of the talk has now through the years, actually through a lot of research where it was resisted in the beginning, people are beginning to understand that and are beginning to take it seriously, because a lot of research has actually been done on it. Okay, so nutrient supply to the fetus depends on two main things. One is the maternal dietary intake, and secondly, placental function. And in my practice, when I see a baby who is not growing adequately, you have got to discriminate between these two factors. What is going on here? Why is this baby not growing adequately? Is it the maternal intake that's not adequate, or is it the placenta that's not functioning? Okay, let's go on. Now, just to almost summarize what we have said now, up till now, a starved fetus adapts to the lack of nutrients by, number one, slowing the rate of cell division. So there's fewer cells in each organ. Organs are smaller. Secondly, reprogramming their body metabolism. Okay, so that they can, it's almost a preservation mechanism, so that they can preserve what they get. And thirdly, the redistribution of blood flow to preserve the more important organs in their bodies. Right. So babies who adapted for a low-calorie, low-fat diet in the womb, but find themselves in a high-calorie, high-fat environment after birth, they are at the highest risk for rapid weight gain and type 2 diabetes later in life. Okay, and it does not get better. Fetal starvation permanently affects the structure and the function of organs. So I want you guys to just take your cell phone and take a picture of this slide, because if you can find this article, it is actually giving you what I have summarized in a nutshell. It is giving you in far much more detail. And I think you can all do with just reading through it, getting into it. It is very interesting, and I'm sure it's going to help you also in your future practice. Right, so now we're going to look at fetal growth and how this knowledge impacts our practice. Okay, so normal intrauterine growth, we already said, is determined by two factors. The mother's ability to nourish her baby through a healthy diet, and secondly, the placenta's ability to supply nutrients. So it is critical that health professionals promote healthy eating habits during pregnancy to maximize each child's potential and growth. So I'll just share with you very briefly what I do in my practice. So if I see a baby who is not growing adequately, as it should be growing, and it normally manifests in the abdominal circumference. So I see an abdominal circumference that is, say, 2 weeks behind the gestational age. So immediately I will start quizzing my mother about her diet. What is the main diet that you eat? And you know what? Often pregnant ladies cannot eat meat. They have an aversion to meat. And your protein intake is extremely important in pregnancy because your baby's cells are depending on protein in order for that child to grow adequately. So then we will see how we can guide her and advise her to eat other forms of protein. There are so many other forms of protein except for meat that she can take. You know, you've got your beans and your legumes and nuts, your eggs and cheese and, you know, whatever. Often they might still battle. So in South Africa, and I'm sure in your environment, you might also find that, there is a protein shake that is formulated specifically for pregnant mothers. And then we encourage them to substitute one meal with the protein shake. Disguise it, because it's not very pleasant to take. Disguise it in maybe a fruit smoothie or in yogurt or something that makes it more palatable. So that's the first thing that we look at, is at the mother's diet. If I do see that the placenta is aging prematurely, or if the amniotic fluid is low, there are any signs of placental failure, then obviously we will go over to the ultrasound assessment of the placental function. So the rest of the talk, we will just go through that a little bit. So here we see our intrauterine growth restricted fetus, and not the symmetrical one, but the one that is asymmetrical, where the abdominal circumference is smaller than the other growth parameters. So this implies that the fetus has not achieved its optimal growth potential. And here we need to obviously step in and help our referring physicians or the midwives or whoever the caregivers are of these pregnant ladies. We've got to help them and guide them into the best possible management of these babies. So this is normally diagnosed when serial third trimester scans show us that the abdominal circumference is now falling below the 10th centile for a particular gestational age. You know, the new ultrasound machines, they all give us a little weight or growth graph, and that gives us the 50th and the 10th centile. So it's very easy to see when that baby starts getting into a danger zone. So asymmetrical IUGR is obviously the leading cause of perinatal mortality and morbidity, and it is a pathological condition which needs very close monitoring, and we can really, as sonographers, we can really help in this regard. So how are we going to diagnose IUGR? So the important thing is here that you need a first trimester dating scan. And I know it is not always possible. In South Africa, for sure, in our government antenatal clinics, patients are discouraged from coming early because obviously the midwives cannot palpate the pregnancy before 16 weeks. They cannot pick up the fetal heartbeat with their CTGs. So they don't really know what to do with the patients if they present early. So we are trying to re-educate the midwives and encourage them to, if they have an ultrasound unit in their clinic, to use that to date the pregnancy early, so that we have a good age of the fetus. So your precise dating is essential because it provides us a baseline for the monitoring of fetal growth. And we all know that the crown rump length measurement is the most accurate dating method. The second trimester scan is used to exclude structural abnormalities which could cause the fetus to be small for gestational age, but symmetrically small. There we are looking at things such as chromosomal disorders, maybe in signs of infection, things like that. While in your third trimester, when we pick up asymmetrical IUGR, we need to do 2 or 3 weekly serial scans to monitor growth. Okay, so there we use ultrasound pyometry and we do the BPD, the head circumference, abdominal circumference, and femur length, of which the abdominal circumference is the most sensitive parameter to tell us whether this fetus is actually getting enough nutrition, whatever the method may be through which it is lacking. So brain sparing is the phenomenon which we already touched on earlier, where there is redistribution of blood flow in the fetus so that more blood is shunted to the brain and the heart and the adrenals at the expense of other organs, which is the kidneys, the liver, the pancreas, the intestines, and so on. So that has got it can have an acute effect on the baby, but we don't have time to go into all of that. In the beginning, with brain sparing, the only parameter, growth parameter, that we will see that is affected is the abdominal circumference. The head circumference and the BPD will still be in line with the age of the baby because that is spared. The brain is spared. The other things that we have to look at is your amniotic fluid volume. So in your asymmetrical growth restriction, there is now decreased perfusion through brain sparing to the kidneys, which means that the kidneys will not have the same urine output as a normal in a normal pregnancy, and therefore the amniotic fluid volume will drop since the amniotic fluid is partially made up of fetal urine. And here you will expect that the largest pocket of amniotic fluid will be less than 2 centimeters. But in most cases, sonographers tend to do the amniotic fluid index, where we measure the 4 quadrants, and each quadrant we measure the deepest pool of fluid, add the 4 pools together, and roughly that then should lie between 10 and 20 centimeters. Below 10, it borders on oligohydramnios, and above 20 borders on polyhydramnios. Fetal weight estimate is important in our growth-restricted fetuses because it helps to determine the optimal time of delivery also. So it does have relevance. I don't know if any of you do the biophysical profile. It is not regularly used because it's very time consuming. You can, if you want to know more about that, you feel welcome. You can go and read up on it. There are different criteria that you have to look at, and it is then scored against a scoring table. And that also helps you to then determine the well-being of the baby. But the most sensitive parameters that we can use in ultrasound is our spectral Doppler assessment. And we do that of the maternal and the fetal circulations. I'm not going to go much into the maternal circulation, which is the uterine artery Doppler. That is something that we tend to do in high-risk patients, where we are expecting that there might be preeclampsia. So your maternal circulation is already monitored as from the first trimester before the onset of fetal growth restriction. And that is basically to diagnose the possibility of growth restriction or preeclampsia before it actually manifests in the mother. But we are going to look at the fetal circulation. So just to help you understand it a little bit better, the amount of blood that flows into a vascular bed depends on 2 things. Number 1, the number of blood vessels. And number 2, the size of blood vessels. Now, I'm going to make it very easy for you. I'm going to use the analogy of a road. You have a road between 2 cities. And if you want, say for instance, there's high congestion on the road. So there's a lot of cars that travel. In Gauteng, it would be between Johannesburg and Pretoria. So there's a lot of cars that have to travel on a daily basis between the 2 cities. If I want to relieve the congestion, I have to do one of 2 things. Either I must make the road wider, or I must make more lanes. So if there are more lanes, more cars can travel at a normal speed. So more lanes will give us a lower resistance to flow. A wider road, if it's between 2 smaller towns where we don't need 2 lanes, but we want at least the possibility of people being able to pull off a little bit and still let the traffic flow, we must make the lane bigger or wider. So if the number of vessels or the size of the vessels decrease, less blood will flow and a high resistance to flow is recorded. But if you have more blood vessels that form, or existing vessels dilate, then more blood will flow and a low resistance to flow will be recorded. So just to make it relevant to a pregnancy. A 12-week-old pregnancy, the placenta is small. So it's in relation to a 12-week fetus. So there are blood vessels and there is flow between the fetus and the placenta, but it's not high flow. It's just few blood vessels. When we reach 24 weeks, the placenta has grown in order to feed the growing baby. So there are now more vascular channels. There's more lanes open. And so from 12 weeks to 24 weeks, the resistance would have lowered. Now when you get to 36 weeks, the placenta is still growing. It grows up to 36 weeks, creating new vascular channels. And so at 36 weeks, the resistance to flow into the placenta should be less than at 24 weeks. So I hope that is, you understand that concept. So how do we now interpret the Doppler waveform? If you look at this picture, you'll see you've got the baseline. And then on the lower part, below the baseline, that indicates flow towards the fetus. Above the baseline indicates flow towards the placenta. Okay, so we know that the umbilical vein is indicated now below the baseline. And that is blood that flows from the placenta into the fetus. Umbilical vein takes all the good stuff, takes the nutrients and the oxygen to the baby, so it flows towards the fetus. But in the umbilical arteries, blood flows from the fetal circulation to the placenta. And so that is blood flowing then from fetus to the placenta. And that's the important blood flow that we are going to consider in our Doppler. So you'll see that number 1 indicates peak systole and number 2 indicates end diastole. Now when the fetal heart contracts, blood flow is under pressure and therefore peak systole is high. But during diastole, when there is no contraction of the ventricle, it means blood is stopping. No, it shouldn't stop. There should still be passive flow in the direction of the placenta. So let's then look at Doppler assessment, and I'm in particular going to go to the fetal circulation. It's just the maternal circulation. I'm going to skip that. So here we're looking at the umbilical artery Doppler. And what do we see here? In the first image at the top, there is normal high diastolic flow, which indicates that there is little resistance in the placenta. So it means that there is enough vascular channels that are open, and so blood is just flowing passively into the placenta. That's what makes us happy. The second image at the bottom, you can see that your end diastolic flow now is very little, which means that blood is battling to flow passively into the placenta. And that tells me that vascular channels have closed. Instead of new vascular channels opening, arteries now, small blood vessels have been occluded. And that is part of your preeclampsia picture. Maybe one day we can look more at preeclampsia and how that works and how it brings this picture about. So here we see in the last two images, we see absent end-diastolic flow. Now, there's no flow during diastole. So what is happening? If you go back to the analogy of the road, say we have 3 lanes between Johannesburg and Pretoria. Now, one lane they are doing road works on. So they close the one lane because they are now fixing a pothole. By the way, potholes is terrible in South Africa. I don't know how it's on your side of the world, but here you have to drive with your eyes wide open. So now one lane is closed. So what's going to happen? The traffic will still flow, but it will flow at a congested speed, at a slower speed. But now there's another lane is closed because of maybe a car accident. And of the 3 lanes, only one is open. What's going to happen? The traffic is going to stop. And this is what is happening in picture number D. The traffic has stopped. Blood flow has stopped. This is really bad. And if you look at picture number E, then that is when you see a car that goes over the middle lane and goes back into the direction from where it came because it cannot go forward. And that is an indication that this baby is about to be delivered. So that baby must come out. The middle cerebral artery Doppler, however, is even more sensitive because it's a direct display of brain sparing. Okay, so we said earlier that there are 2 mechanisms by which the resistance will become lower or higher. So say if we want a low resistant bed, then number 1, the lanes must either be wider or we have to have more lanes. So we've seen in the placenta, when the resistance in the placenta goes higher, the lanes have closed. We have fewer lanes. When the resistance is low, it means there are increased number of lanes. That's what we want to see. But in the fetal brain, it works differently. So a normal vascular bed in a fetal brain has got quite a high resistance. If you look at your picture on the right, your Doppler trace, and you will see that there is low end-diastolic flow, which is correct. That is normal in a fetus who grows at a normal rate and who gets enough nutrition. So that's completely normal. So what is going to happen in brain sparing? How does the fetus redistribute or re-regulate the blood flow to certain organs? It is by constricting vessels that go to the liver and the gut and the kidneys, and by dilating vessels that go to the brain and the heart. So if the line opens, if we make the line wider, what is going to happen in end diastole? It is going to show very low resistance. And if you look at these 2 images, then you'll see on the left, normal MCA flow has got low end diastolic flow, indicating a relatively high resistance vascular bed. On the right, abnormal MCA flow shows us high end diastolic flow, low resistance, which tells us that there is already brain sparing. I've just added a few cutoff values. If you wanted to work on the pulsatility index and index, but just by looking at your Doppler trace already, you know exactly what is going on. So the last vessel that we have to sample is your ductus venosus. So we start with the umbilical artery. When we see that, or we start with the normal growth parameters. When we see the abdominal circumference is shrinking, we start with our Dopplers. Umbilical artery, when we see that we have, we're developing a high resistance vascular bed in the placenta, you move on to the middle cerebral artery. When you see that you have a low resistance bed in the brain, you immediately move on to your ductus venosus. And the ductus venosus, because it's so close to your IVC and so close to your right atrium, it actually is an indication of what is happening in the fetus's heart. So the motion of the heart gives you a venous flow that is phasic. And it's got that little M pattern. And if there is cardiac failure, where the blood cannot be deposited into the right atrium, or it cannot get out of the right ventricle because there is cardiac failure, it will push back into the ductus venosus, and you will see the reversed flow there. Right, so I didn't go into the techniques of how to do this, different Doppler traces, but it will help you in interpreting your Doppler trace and your image. So absent or reverse umbilical artery end-diastolic flow and increased flow in the middle cerebral artery, and then reverse flow in the ductus venosus indicates delivery. That baby is in distress, it's on its way out. Okay, so in conclusion, ultrasound plays a vital role in the diagnosis and the management of the growth-restricted fetus. And ultrasound surveillance, if it is done correctly, it reduces your perinatal mortality and morbidity rates, and it gives us better outcomes. I hope that you've gained something from this presentation, that you will look at your fetus much more critically in the future, determine whether the problem, the growth restriction, comes from a nutritional point or whether it comes from a placental point, placenta that is failing. And in so doing, you can take hands with the whole team in order to save our babies on the continent. So here's just a list of information and where you can find some of the information that I have. And thank you very much. That is me.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you for quite an interesting and inciting presentation. I've always told my colleagues that you think you know obstetric scanning until you meet Barbara. And once you meet Barbara, your scanning will never be the same in the obstetric field. So I'm sure everyone who is in this meeting agrees with me that we now have a better image, a better picture about scanning these mothers and these babies. So for now, we are now opening the floor for any questions, anyone who has got comments or contributions.
I would very much like also to get your practices, you know, because I am still learning every day. I am honest with you, I'm still learning every day, and I would love to also learn from you guys.
Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone is hearing that, to keep on sharing the cases and consulting as well, helping in each other in this field of scanning, because you can never know it all. We help each other grow as we go. Do you have any questions?
Maybe some comments?
Yes, some comments.
Good evening.
Hi, Vicky.
Hi, I just want to appreciate you, Barbara, for that presentation. It's very informative. I have learned a lot. Really, it's new every day. Thank you so much.
Did you find it interesting, Vicky?
Yes?
Have you ever heard of the Barker hypothesis?
No, I'm hearing a lot of new information, even from just the background of what you gave us. That's a lot of new information that we actually don't bother to know the nutrition of a mother. We get a request and we go straight to just doing a scan.
But from now on, you're going to look at your mommies with different eyes. Yeah, I hope that you will look at them with totally different eyes and, you know, really work hand in hand with their caregivers to make sure that we save our babies and that we give them the best possible start in life.
Musamvu, you have a hand up. You can pose your question.
He must just take his
Okay. Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. Musambu here. I would love to actually just say thank you for. I think for me, it's a confirmation on what we were actually discussing yesterday with a certain colleague, though she's in the nursing profession. You'd find that in some rural, there's a certain rural setup in Zambia, in Chisali, to be specific.
Yes.
What has been noted is the age range that the age range of people being discovered and the numbers of people being discovered or being diagnosed being diagnosed to have DM diabetes is an age range that you look at and be like, okay, this is not supposed to be, this is not correct. But with this hypothesis, it gives me an insight to why a 26-year-old or a 25-year-old in a village setup would actually have diabetes. The development, the fetal development and the organ development, because of the environment, as you were explaining, I kept on confirming, I kept on realizing that definitely diet, the environment, the setup itself will affect everything, because it's definitely, as you said, the body will be anticipating the same kind of